I'm Thomas, and you're listening to the Gracing Podcast, where today I am stoked to be joined by one of the top and most well-known, highly regarded gravel pros, namely Payson McElveen. But actually, you might know him more as the host of the newly rebranded With Pace podcast. Super stoked to have you on, Payson.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. It's a pleasure. I've heard your voice on a few episodes of the podcast, so it's great to put a face with the voice.
And I'm super happy because people will probably assume that I have you on to recap Leadville. And yes, we will do some housekeeping and briefly touch on Leadville. But the main reason why I invited you is because something you like touching upon on your pod regularly, occasionally, is the future of gravel, the present state, a bit of the behind the scenes, the business, the evolving themes and trend lines of the sport itself. And that is what I really want to dive deep today. And yeah, thanks again for taking the time. But as I said, let's start with a few words about Leadville, where you ended up having a very good result and your first lifetime Grand Prix result this season, finishing fifth after already winning the Leadville stage race just the 2 weeks, 1 week, 1.5 weeks prior, or whatever. Timing is relative. So how was your day? Because actually we didn't see a lot of you on the live stream.
Yeah, it's tough when Keegan's 20 minutes ahead of everybody else. I think it makes it hard on the TV crew.
Yeah.
I had a great race, especially under the circumstances of how my year has been so far with the hip injury and stuff. It was one of those days. Leadville's a funny race, and that I think we talk a lot about these long gravel races kind of allowing some room for error, especially at something like Unbound, even though it's really tactical. They're so long and they're so grueling that even if you have a bad moment or you have some bad luck, you have time to kind of fix problems and still have a good day. Leadville is almost even more so that way because it's so hard that at some point, even Keegan is just going to be, completely on the floor, kind of surviving, trying to get up power line. So I had honestly not the best day physically. The numbers were, pretty average based on, compared to what I did in the stage race and some training and stuff. But the race is such a beatdown that fortunately I was kind of able to come back at the end and, I was sort of on the bubble of finishing top 10 actually up until the last hour. And then just with the way that race plays out, you can kind of pick up some bodies on the way home as people fall apart. So luckily I was able to sneak onto the podium there at the 11th hour.
Yeah, well done. So, from an recovery perspective, you are fully on track again. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I've actually felt really, really good in training. But I was still pretty nervous going into this one because everyone knows there's quite a big difference between training and racing. And the one thing I did feel in the race is just a little bit of lack of exposure to kind of what I was just describing when in a race, you're not really in control of your effort. You're just responding to what others are doing. So inevitably, you have a plan on paper, but then you get to the top of Columbine or you get to power line and you just feel kind of like you're on your last legs. And then it becomes more of a mental thing. And because I, didn't really have like one of those really hard 6+ hour races in the legs in a long, long time, I think I was lacking just a little bit of that depth kind of. Just sort of like aerobic capacity, maybe call it. So we were able to like get my threshold numbers up really well before the race and all that sort of thing. But I was maybe, just had a tiny bit of rustiness still, which is fine. I mean, if you told me the day after Sea Otter when I was, getting x-rays and such, that I would be fifth at Leadville 3 months later, I 100% would have taken that deal. No question.
Was it your best ever finishing time at Leadville? I didn't check.
No, it was actually a little bit slower than last year.
Okay.
Everyone was slower than last year, besides the ladies. Melissa was faster, and obviously Kate was faster than anyone has ever done it. But on the men's side, Keegan was a little bit slower. I was about 5 or 6 minutes slower this year, and I actually did a little bit higher power numbers. So, assuming that it was just some course condition stuff and wind direction stuff, which a lot of people have talked about.
Like, obviously our audience here is largely Europe based.
Mm-hmm.
How would you describe Leadville to somebody who is not as well versed in like American endurance mountain biking / off-road racing? Because obviously it's an iconic race, and I think I at some point had a period where I was listening to a lot of the Trainer Road podcast stuff, and they every year dive deep. So I think I have a fairly good understanding of the race and what it demands. But how would you describe it to somebody who's not really into it? Because it's different from most mountain bike races, and it's also not a gravel race, at least on paper.
Right. Yeah, it's sort of, in a lot of ways, it's kind of like just a super epic old school mountain bike challenge in the context of what mountain biking was at its origination. So, there's differing stories about when mountain biking was invented. Many people have heard about, Gary Fisher on Mount Tam and the clunkers and that whole sort of origin story. But there's also another origin story about off-road riding, early mountain biking in the 80s, late 70s, going up and over what's called Pearl Pass between Crested Butte and Aspen, which is in that area, using bikes to actually run paraphernalia back and forth across the mountains and over these, crazy old mining roads. And that's really what Leadville is. There are technical sections. There are sections where bike handling helps enormously, but by and large, it's just a really, really tough off-road bike race. Traditionally, it's been called a mountain bike race, but as we see bikes evolve, all of a sudden the bikes are starting to look a little bit more like gravel bikes, at least in the handlebars. But most people, I think, are pretty settled on the fact that it is a full suspension course for sure. So if that tells you anything about the roughness, it is a very rough course.
And this year, allegedly, the course was rougher than in prior years. Can you confirm?
Yeah, it was. And that's because of kind of two things. One, there was some pretty heavy rain in the month before, which obviously creates a little bit of erosion, but then it dried out a lot. And actually 2 weeks ago when I did the stage race, the course was really fast, but then over the course of only a couple of weeks of drought, it completely changed. And when it gets really dry, it gets loose, and the rocks that are affixed into the earth get loose, start rolling around, pile up together, get nasty. But one of the bigger things is the substrate there. The soil is very sandy. And so when that sand dries out, it gets really, really slippery. And that's one of the areas, it's one of the reasons that I think a full suspension is the right choice of bike, is because you just have that bit more traction. Everyone talks about the power line descent, which is the most technical. But it's one of those things where if you rode the descent very slowly and carefully, it would feel medium technical. But when you're racing, you're going easily average 40K an hour and then going well over 50K an hour, close to 60K an hour in spots. And then all of a sudden it gets really technical. So it's kind of one of those things. But the really two defining characteristics are just that it's really, really high. The starting line, the low point really is higher than, Col de la Loze, or the highest points in the Tour or Grand Tour. Those are the low points. And then there's just a lot of climbing. If you look at total meters gained and just sort of the characteristics of a climb, it almost looks a little bit like, I don't know, a short Queen stage of a Grand Tour or something.
Yeah, like when I wrote my preview over on the gravel stack, I checked it out in meters, so it's never really below 2,000 meters of elevation and goes up to 3.8. That, of course, is like the peak of Columbine. So yeah, it's a proper elevation, which, by the way, like in my previews, I always create these three tiers where I have top favorites, podium contenders, and wildcards. And like my first impulse on the man side was to say, look, Keegan can be the only one in the top favorites bucket. However, I convinced myself to put Simon Pilot in there as well, because I checked out, like I do when I create these previews, his preparation, and I saw he was doing this Chinese road race before, like stage race, I think 1 week stage race. The Tour of Magnificent, whatever, I can't pronounce it, will not attempt to do it. But it's like one of these kind of famous Chinese stage races where even the flat stages are also at 2,000 meters of elevation, and then they climb up to also close to 4,000 meters. And he was second in the mountain classification. So I convinced myself that he probably prepared. But yeah, that's the type of altitude in Europe hard to find.
Yeah, no, I mean, that was a great call. Clearly, he had an awesome race. He was on my short list of folks to be on the podium also, in part for that reason, but also he spends much of his year in Colombia on really high elevation. And so, yeah, without a doubt, that is super, super key to having a good race there. And even someone like John Gaston, who barely races a bike at all, shows that if you just have a massive aerobic engine and you spend your life at high elevation, you can do a great race there.
Because really something that is my understanding, like being in the bunch or in the group is not necessarily positive, could even be detrimental if it inspires you to go above your limit. But it's just really the key is more or less to manage your effort and do so quite well. And even at like the top, at the pointy end where you guys are racing for amateurs, I mean, most race is probably like this, but that is my understanding, that it's really a pitfall if you try to surf wheels too much and go beyond what you should do, just because of the altitude and where it's happening. So it's not really a time trial, but it's more or less that kind of effort.
Yeah, it's actually really tricky because that's exactly right. But then sort of the wild card that's thrown in there is what's called the pipeline section, which is an hour of almost flat. It has sort of some rollers in it, but on the way out after the power line descent, you have nearly an hour of, average speed 40K an hour before you hit Columbine, the big, oars category climb. And then you turn around and of course do it all in reverse. So you have that hour long section of flat again. So it's one of those things where you really have to, it's a delicate balance because you have to stay within yourself. But if you end up solo on those sections, your race is vastly negatively impacted. You really need to be in a group for those long flat sections. So it's a really tricky one. And in the last, I've done this race since 2017. And so I've sort of seen its evolution. And it used to be super, super formulaic, and people were much more conservative on the first couple of climbs. And we'd have a big group of 10, 12, 14 riders. And that was when, there was a much larger spread in ability level between the top 10. Now you have a much deeper field. So you have 20 or 30 guys who are capable of being in the top 10 on any given day. But the group on pipeline, the flat section, the groups are now much smaller because it's raced so much more aggressively from the start, sort of counterintuitively. And you're getting more road racing sort of dynamics where groups will split apart on the flat section and come back together, and people will roll the dice and try to get ahead before Columbine. Yeah, so the race has completely changed in the last couple of years in that regard.
Interesting. I mean, yeah, like for a European, it's probably not as iconic, but then on the other hand, I think it's so relevant. And it's interesting. You described it earlier very similarly to the way when I previewed it, I also debated, because that was something people liked talking about. Is it actually still a mountain bike race, or is it a gravel race? And I described it as like the shift that we see, as you said, in bikes, but also in races, is it gets more and more technical. And Leadville being as old as it is, like probably nowadays you wouldn't design a mountain bike race in this way anymore. But then it's also, I landed on, it's like the most gravel coded mountain bike race is where I ended up on, which I don't know what your take is on this, but I don't think it's a gravel race.
I definitely don't think it's a gravel race either. I think you could maybe define what's a gravel race versus a mountain bike race based on what frame people ride. And I don't know of anyone that's ever tried riding or racing a gravel frame at Leadville. But the truth is, I mean, as the sport continues, as the off-road side of the sport continues to evolve and the front of the races continue to experiment with bike setup, it's becoming more and more of a spectrum rather than categorizations. I think, you have something like Rule of Three in Bentonville, Arkansas, that has 30 miles of single track, and people are talking about using full suspension mountain bikes there with drop bars next year. So who knows? Who knows?
I mean, that's a good segue to the main topic. So unless you have any important Leadville remarks, let's talk future of gravel.
Let's do it.
And the way I want to do it is to throw a few predictions, kind of. I mean, I'm of the school of thought that I don't really like predicting stuff, but let's still do it because it's more fun. You can also think about it as storylines to watch or whatever way you want to do it. But let's start here. Consolidation is coming to gravel. Let's preface this with, I think, one of the most interesting things that happened in gravel, unlike in most other cycling disciplines, is we had from the get-go, and still have to this day, competition. So in most other cycling disciplines, they are operated by the UCI, and this for various reasons, mostly the US-based origin and the counterculture that was important to the foundational years, and maybe is to an extent still until today. Made it so that it was not UCI owned. Nowadays, of course, we have the UCI play a role, but not the role in the sport. We have the Lifetime Grand Prix, we have Gravel Earth Series, we have Belgian Waffle Ride, and there is this competition, which is awesome. And I think it is very good and important that we hopefully have a few more years of these series competing. But then as it goes in sports, which are in the end like an entertaining product, especially if we talk about like spectator sports where gravel is increasingly headed. So mass participation sports don't necessarily have this property, but as we see gravel more and more turning into a spectator sport, we are also seeing, I talk to a lot of promoters, they tell me, look, it's getting harder to sell out. A few years ago, every race was sold out right from the get-go. That is changing. And I think we are going to see one of the big three or big four, depending on whether you still count Belgian Waffle Ride as one of the big ones out there. But I assume we will have a eventual winner. I'm not going to predict which one it is. Like a few years ago, probably Lifetime would have been the runaway favorite, especially from a US perspective. But like media coverage and so on was so focused. But I think Gravel Earth Series definitely took a leap forward this season, especially by adding US races. So it's more of a interesting competition. So consolidation is coming. What's your take on this?
Yeah. From a consolidation standpoint, do you mean a certain number of events will just cease to exist because they're not viable anymore, or there will be acquisitions and merging and such, or some of both?
I think both potentially. So
Uh-huh.
I definitely feel like we did get so many new races, especially in Europe over the last 2 3 years. I mean, the entire UCI series consists of not exclusively, but mostly races that were created to be UCI Gravel World Series races.
Mm-hmm.
We have other grassroots events and races, and I think even in the US, like in the last 4 or 5 years, a lot of them were created because promoters saw how well it goes, and some will disappear. We see the interesting move because, like, Lifetime, for those who are not aware, they buy the events that become part of the series. Gravel Earth Series partners and has like a licensing arrangement with the promoters. So we saw already quite notable standalone races joining forces with Gravel Earth. Let's see if this
Mm-hmm.
continues in the next season. But we saw this, and I don't feel like we can have like 4 important series out there. And how this is going to be resolved, let's see. But
Yeah.
that is probably also one of the parts where you have some insights and thoughts on.
Yeah. I mean, of course, it's a really complicated conversation, and without a doubt, some level of consolidation needs to happen, in my opinion. Um, I always think it's good to look at history and often look at the history of other disciplines. I've said this many times, but I think sometimes a mistake of gravel racing is to look to the World Tour for inspiration or um,
Oh,
long-term
please don't.
long-term aspirations. And yeah, that just makes me a little nervous because I don't think we need a AAA league of the World Tour, shall we say? If you, it's sort of a baseball term, but we don't need a B level road scene. The road is wonderful for many reasons. We don't need to copy it. Looking back at history, though, so here in the States, we had this heyday of cyclocross racing back in
Mhm.
kind of the early 2010s. The USGP, it was called. Actually, I think it was the US Grand Prix of cyclocross. And it was this wonderfully cohesive series, great payout. But the biggest thing was that brands cared, and that there were corporate sponsorships, and there were factory teams, and there were stars, and there was media that there was every race was live streamed, and it felt like a proper little league. Unfortunately, then what happened is, because of that boom, lots of other events saw dollar signs, saw opportunities, saw business opportunities. And within just a very few short years, there were UCI races, because this USGP they were all UCI events. All of a sudden, you had 3 UCI races on any given weekend, and every race was claiming to be the race, and the talent was completely spread out. Jeremy Powers maybe was at one race, and Jamie Driscoll and Tim Johnson were at a different race, and the fans didn't know what to care about, really. And then also, brands were spread really thin in terms of how they supported the events, how they marketed the events, and the storytelling of it all just got very convoluted. And I think that's kind of where we are with gravel right now. I remember during the Oregon Trail race weekend, for example, we had Oregon Trail, and then on the very same weekend we had Steamboat Gravel, I believe, and then on the very same weekend we had Belgian Waffle Ride, Boise, Idaho. And
I wrote
yeah,
about this on this weekend because we had some European gravel races on as well on the same weekend, and it was crazy. That is which triggered me to start creating a classification system for gravel races to know what matters, because we are almost at this point nowadays. Because as you know, on the road we have like world tour races, then 1.1, 1.2, 2.1, 2.2, and so on. And I think in gravel we don't have this to know what really matters. And just because it's so much going on these days, I started creating a system like this and wrote about it. But yeah, fully agree.
Yeah, so I guess my short answer there is that's not a short answer, but obviously that needs to change. I think right now so gravel obviously needs to be global. Like that is one of the wonderful things. There's so many wonderful aspects about the globalization of gravel. And I think that there can be a very healthy US based series like the Grand Prix, and there can be, because I don't really see a scenario in which the Grand Prix goes international. They've been pretty outspoken about their goal is to grow and establish fandom in the United States for bike racing, because we don't have world tour races really in the States anymore, right? Like this is our bike racing show in the US.
Yeah, and then also let's not forget, I mean, they are in the end a marketing vehicle for lifetime gyms, and we don't have them in Europe. So why would they? Which is, to an extent, I feel like it's a shame. I would find it interesting, but then that is probably exactly the opportunity that that Gravel Earth series saw or stumbled into, maybe, who knows.
Right. And I would like to get to Gravel Earth here in a second, but I think there's, just to finish the thought on the Lifetime series, I think there's some people who rightfully assume that Lifetime is involved just because it's kind of a fun little side project for them. And, 1 year they'll have a board meeting and they'll be like, you know what, not this year for the Grand Prix anymore, and it'll be gone. But I can assure you that from an economic standpoint, that's not the case. The Grand Prix series is extremely important to them for a handful of different reasons in the larger scope of their lifetime business. Not necessarily from a profit standpoint, but from some other key aspects. And, they're a publicly traded company, and having the Grand Prix is very good for them. In the larger context of their company. So that's one piece that is very encouraging for those of us as racers, is that it really does feel like there's long-term investment there and stability. So putting that aside,
just a little note on there, because probably not all of our listeners are aware, and even I don't know the details. I just know on your podcast you mention regularly that you have, besides racing in the Lifetime Grand Prix, you have also some kind of relationship. They sponsor the podcast or something, so you know a bit of the stuff that is going on behind the scenes there. You're not just racing there, so you can
So I guess I should clarify that. So basically, this gets into a whole long story about like how I ended up in this racing scene, but I was one of the kind of the first of the current generation to adopt like the Leadville 100 and some of these other mass participation events as the races that I was going to focus on back in 2017. And that was before the big gravel explosion really happened. And so I got to know a lot of these Lifetime employees personally, and I have them as personal friends. It's certainly a working relationship, and sometimes there's some challenges there because I disagree with things they do, but by and large, I have, some unique insights, I guess. In terms of professional relationship, they support our Grand Prix recap episodes. They're supporting our upcoming YouTube video about Leadville. But that's where it stops. They just do some advertising. And then beyond that, sometimes we trade ideas just because, I've been around the races for a decade and that sort of thing. But that's sort of the extent of it. Just to
but when you say when you say like, look, it's important to them, it's not just you reading the tea leaves. You actually have a very educated, not even a guess, but you're aware that is the case. Full stop.
I've been told by people who have intimate information about their business workings at the Grand Prix, and these races as a whole, I should say, are quite a prized aspect of what they do, and it's something they love to do. I think that's another important component is these folks who work for a multi-billion-dollar brand that extends far beyond cycling. Love these events. They love the Leadville 100. They, up and down the corporate structure there, they love to do the Leadville 100, and many of them have done it for over a decade.
Long you mean before, like riding it? It's not only like okay.
Long before they acquired these events, employees participated in them.
Interesting.
So anyway. Okay.
Because then many companies engage in these sports to wine and dine people. I don't think that is happening right now in gravel, that you bring your business contacts to gravel races, but let's see where this goes.
Gravel Earth. I think Gravel Earth has enormous potential, but I would love to see them figure out a way to make people care more about the series and the points. Because right now, even as someone who's a very plugged in fan, I couldn't tell you who's sitting first, second, third. No way. And this was sort of driven home for me when I went to check the point standings last week, maybe 10 days ago, and the points that I earned from Oregon Trail, for example, still hadn't been updated. My fourth place, I wasn't even on the results, on the overall. So I think
that there's on the Instagram. Because
on
sometimes
the
web. On the web, yeah. Because the funny thing is, as somebody who regularly checks these things, I realized that very often Instagram is more accurate and quicker than websites, which is not the state you would expect, but it's the state of gravel in 2025.
True, but that's tough because Instagram sort of goes in one ear and out the other.
Yeah, fully agree.
It can be hard to. It's a bit hard to use that as a resource. But my point is, I think their races are incredible. Their portfolio of races. They have these massively aspirational races, right? Like the Rift, for example. There are so many riders who want to go do that as a bucket list participation, whether pro or not, in the same way that folks want to do Unbound or Leadville. It's so unique. That's a massive strength. I think their business model is really fascinating, and they've done a great job of pulling really unique races together and creating a really compelling brand. From my perspective, I'll just put it to you this way. I don't have any sponsors that really care about where I finish in the series, in the Graveler series at this point.
Yeah, and the prize money is not on par with lifetime Grand Prix either. So that would be the second thing to make the overall important, is prize purse.
Yeah.
Big.
Yep. And I think that there could be some work done in terms of just the point structure so that there's more accountability, so that we see more of the top racers race head to head and have it be a greater reflection of who the best Gravel Earth Series racer was for the year. And some attempt has been made there in regards to weighting, Traca more than others, for example, which makes a ton of sense. But correct me if I'm wrong. I think Oregon Trail and the Traca had equal points. I don't think anyone would argue that those two fields were equally competitive, right?
Yeah, I think Oregon they put as a plus 20% race as well, like the Traca. And then, because another one that happened recently in the US was plus 10% only, but I think Oregon was also on the 20% bonus level. Now, I agree. I also especially how they handle stage races. I don't think it's the ideal solution, because you only get points for the GC overall and not for the individual stages, which I think could be optimized. What I like about their system so far, which I by no means it's perfect, but what I like is that, especially because it's so many races all across the globe. I think this season they are close to 30. that they say, I think this season it's 3 or maybe 4 races that you need points from to qualify for the finale in Spain, the Rancho gravel. Maybe it should be a bit more than this out of 30. I don't know, but that they don't say, look, you need to race 30 races or get points from all of these, but we take the best, your best to 4 or X results, I think makes sense, especially because let's assume it was a strategic or on purpose decision to this year at so many US based races. I think what it did is like it made it much easier for domestic racers in the States or North America for that matter to collect points and qualify for the finale than in past years where it was impossible because you would have had to do as much travel to Europe and then why would you, especially if you're in lifetime. And I think the racers who didn't make it into lifetime now have a much easier access, but it's even you see people like Sophia thinking about if she should do one more of these races just to qualify for Rancho because she's quite decent in the standings, and that is the side effect or intended effect of their growth over there. So yeah, that is and if you would say all races become mandatory, obviously it would become very cumbersome to compete in the series, but maybe they didn't find the sweet spot yet.
Yeah, no, it's very true. I mean, it definitely opens up more opportunity. And I think one of the things that obviously attracts people to gravel and attracts pros to craft their careers around gravel rather than a different discipline in some regards is that freedom to travel, to see the world, to experience new types of courses. And that is a trade-off of the Grand Prix. You know, I felt this myself, and I know many of my peers have also. Do you really want to go back to Schwamigan for the 7th year in a row, hypothetically? Maybe, but I'm sure some people would say, I would really like to go sample a different race.
Yeah.
But if you're in the Grand Prix, you know, you're in a league. And so you are trading professional opportunities for some of that freedom that attracts many people to gravel. So I see both sides for sure. One sort of counter to the gravel earth piece, one of the reasons that I an analogy maybe is the world tour points overall. Does anyone care who has the most UCI points in the world tour? I don't think so.
Teams do. And
but really, do they? I don't know.
I think
UAE claims to, but I think it's just because they're gonna get it and they might as well market it, you know?
Yeah.
Right now it's a race to the bottom. The only point situation you care about is if you're going to get relegated or not. That's what everyone talks about.
That's what I was about to say. Like fans only really care like in the third year. I mean they also handle it very weirdly. Like a 3-year relegation system, yada yada. But let's not talk about road racing and the UCI, but I get what you mean when it comes to Gravel Earth Series. They also have probably they also don't tell the story of the overall well enough. I think I just saw an update this week, but I also didn't memorize it. Who was in the lead on the men's side right now in Gravel Earth? But it was like an Instagram post with the standings. Like and
And you know what? Maybe that is the right thing. Maybe we should have this much more free, diversified thing where it is a little bit more open and there is a lot more freedom and you can have surprise twists and turns going into the final round.
In some sense, it's cool, no? Like Magnus Baklaris, nobody knew his name before this season, and then he turns up at Santa Val, wins it, and then goes on to be super successful, including winning the Rift.
Yeah. I think, maybe it's a mistake to think that the next step is a race goes head to head with the Grand Prix in terms of cohesion and strict points structure and all that sort of thing. Maybe something that has a completely different feel is the right thing. I don't know. I don't know. I think what I do know is that it's great that the Graveler series exists. And yeah, look, if from my standpoint, if say I raced Sandoval and finished top 3, and then I was 4th at Oregon Trail, I probably would be thinking about going to Rebecca's Private Idaho right now and then dropping into Rancho, just because the points opportunity sort of fell into place.
Yeah.
So anyway,
why not?
Why not?
Yeah, consolidation. I mean, we will not come to a final conclusion here, but to me, it is one of the themes I'm monitoring closely. Who is going? I mean, maybe let's close on this. My observation from just listening to people in podcasts like yourself and many others and YouTube is that definitely the mind share among US racers and fans of Gravel Earth Series skyrocketed compared to last season, where nobody really talked about it. Maybe the trucker was the one thing that people knew about, cared about. And this year there is much more, like at least mentions of Gravel Earth Series here and there, and should we care? So I think this at least happened.
Yeah, and I mean, there's no doubting that some of the best gravel events we have are in the Gravel Earth Series. I mean, I'm 95% sure I'll be going to the Rift next year just because it's so darn awesome looking, and the stories that came out of it are great.
I also
we'll see how it
gave
develops.
it the 5th spot in my Monuments of Gravel list. So if you happen to do a good result, you would have won a monument, at least in my book. So
okay, where can we find these resources? By the way, where do you keep track of these things?
That's all on the Gravel Stack newsletter. It's a Substack, like the gravelstack.substack.com. I believe.
Okay.
I'm pretty confident. It's
nice.
URL. You can
You'll
also
have a
find
new
it
subscriber.
Cool. Appreciate it. So let's jump to this next one. The other one probably has a bit more overlap with what we just talked about, but I want to change gears a bit. I believe we are going to have very differing opinions to it. So the hypothesis is teams are coming to gravel, full stop. But or the prediction is this. I think that is not a surprising prediction. Nobody will disagree. But I think this will be critical for the longevity of gravel itself for 2 main reasons. One that I talked about on the podcast a few times already, so listeners will maybe know, but I think talent development and discovery is critical to create an entertaining sports product. You need, like in the US, you have the draft system that people love following, and having young talents come into a sport is critical to make it exciting in the long run. But the current mostly privateer driven setup in gravel doesn't really lend itself to talent discovery, because sponsors, obviously, if there is like a Ted King type of broadcaster or yourself, you have an audience, you are established, and I need to sponsor somebody. I love these people. And then, yes, some brands, especially the endemic brands, they probably care a bit more about results. And then we all know getting these good results in gravel, which is an expensive sport, or the travel we talked about and so on, that needs to be done, even for like US-based riders to get to all these events in this huge country, very often cost prohibitive. Long story short, you need teams to fulfill this function, in my mind, because they have a natural incentive to identify the next big thing and do it. And ideally, if a league, a series plays this right and creates also some tools around it, be that a draft, be that something else, it creates great narratives. Part 1. Part 2, and I think that is also can't be underrated, and you are probably one of the best examples for it. Teams also come with the benefit of division of labor. because if you're in the privateer game, you have so much stuff to do, which to an extent is cool. And I guess like I come from the startup space myself, and I know like doing stuff, building yourself, doing being more of a generalist, touching many ends is cool up to an extent, especially if the sports competition level is so high and the performance you need to bring demands so much of your time. It just becomes very hard nowadays to do both at the top level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
no, I think those are great points. And actually my perspective on this has evolved in the past year because I've seen some of my friends go through this. I mean, just using our little Durango, Colorado community here, for example, we've seen a couple of different versions of this sort of develop. So first example is we have a younger racer here named Kobe Freeburn, who's had a bit of a breakout year. He's had some really awesome results. And I think a piece of that is just him, leveling up physically. But he's part of the MAP Pro Forward program, which is, we sort of have our MAP Privateer program. And then below that is this MAP Pro Forward program. And those riders also get a certain level of support. And what's interesting there is it's very much a privateer development program. So it's almost like an in-between of a team and privateer program. It's like the average in a way, sort of. So that's an interesting model. I've also seen, so Sarah Sturm, for example, took Ellen Campbell under her wing for a few years and kind of taught her a few of the privateer ways and sort of mentored her. But that takes an established pro out of the goodness of their heart, spending time with someone they want to mentor, providing some of their resources. That's not, like you're saying, that's not a path to opening up the economy and opening up a development pipeline. That's not necessarily scalable. Yeah. So I really hear what you're saying in regards to why, without a doubt, right now there's a disconnect, right? Without a doubt, in terms of talent development and new young riders. We're talking juniors, U23s, rising through the ranks to the point where they can do this full-time and professionally. Lifetime this year, introduced their U23 program, and I think it's a great idea, and it has some really solid structure. I don't think they've story told around it very well. Like, it's definitely not getting near it's
mentioned on the broadcasts a little bit, but yeah, that's about the extent of it.
Right. So I think that has potential, but it definitely needs to be leveled up and developed more. So, I agree with you. I think that teams would be a great way to kind of create that next generation and bring talent up. The big question, though, is, well, actually rewinding quickly, gravel still sort of has riders coming from all these different directions, right? Some of our best gravel riders still are just retired pro road racers, Pete Stetina, our friend Paul Voss, Petr Vakosh, like you can just go on and on. And so to be honest, Thomas, it's so complicated and I don't know where it's going because the economy of it can't be ignored either. The finances of it, to really create a long-term program that can develop a legacy of developing riders and bringing new riders in is really expensive. And to have one of those teams, you have to be able to afford at minimum probably 2 of the top riders. There's a whole bunch of rumors flying around right now about some really big bike brands that are maybe going to be making some big steps to having big teams. But
just to loop listeners in, I mean, like these rumors that are flying around even go to the extent that it is a possibility that we are going to have people who are paid to be domestiquing on these teams, which is absolutely not the case at the time being. Even the most notorious teams out there definitely don't pay no rider to be a domestique, and even some team names that you definitely have heard would surprise not you, but probably some of the listeners, that they don't even pay wages to the riders on the team. So that
so
would
it's
be a
good.
big shift.
It would, and I've done a little bit of prying with some of my friends on this, and I have a friend who's who rides for a factory team for one of the biggest bike brands, and they were really pushing for an up in budget to be able to sign domestiques, basically, because they're starting to feel the heat in regards to team tactics, most specifically at Unbound. And, the brand thought about it, but ultimately decided, no, that's not the best return on investment for us at this stage. And I kind of wonder if part of it is because, if we're being completely honest with where brands are getting an ROI, it's a certain group of races that really, create viewership and impressions and all that sort of thing. And of those group of races, the ones that really benefit from having, say, 2 or 3 domestiques is very small. Unbound is the obvious one. Teams there could transform things without a doubt. But most of these races are still so wild, so selective, so mechanical prone that the odds of a brand spending an extra $500,000 or $1 million or multiple millions on bringing more riders in, the likelihood of that resulting in a result is a huge gamble, in my opinion, still. We're not talking road racing where if you magically at the tour could say, we have more money, we're going to have 20 riders on UAE this year. Okay, they're going to have the top 7 spots in the top 10. That's not how gravel is right now. So I don't know. It'll be interesting it'll be interesting how it develops.
But what we talk about on here regularly is like, you earlier you said, look, we cannot just look to the road and copy what is being done on the road. And I think that is very important on many different levels, from what is happening in races to the business side of things. And when we talk about team tactics, it's just not, it's never going to work the same way in many races, because not only are these races tough, but also just something like bringing back a group that went away early. Just if there is a lot of single trail, how would that work? It doesn't work that like your 6-7 guys can sit at the front of the bunch and ride hard to bring back the breakaway, because the races unfold differently. And like you say, some races like Unbound would work well in this way, and many others that matter wouldn't. And would we even like this type of racing? So definitely dynamic racing that is exciting, where stuff happens, especially once it is broadcast, which of course we see is also happening more and more, makes sense. But what I believe is, so the teams in some way or another are coming, and they are going to impact the sport. And that is a good segue to the third prediction, actually. So I don't even know if that is so. So the prediction is kind of, we are in a critical time right now, and the next 2 years are going to be decisive for the sport and how sustainable it is going to be. And my thinking is, now we would need a organization, most likely one of the series, to think much more like a governing body. I don't like the term, but like in the sense, not necessarily in the sense of the UCI, but more in the sense like almost of an NBA, but not only saying, look, there are races and we need to promote them, and here is a series, but also think more deeply about how to structure this emerging sport of gravel on many levels. So when we talk about teams, for instance, I think we need stuff like a rider limit on these teams. It can't be that, I buy the 20 top guys. No, we need to say like, probably a team can have like a maximum of 5, maybe even only 4 riders on the men's and the women's side. And then I think we can see on the road how detrimental it is to the sport, and especially the team side of things, that there is no kind of rev share from especially broadcasting rights. But I think in gravel we need to think, but that's a topic in a few bullet points down, when we talk about, like, we should talk about media rights more broadly, or media revenues more broadly even. But so back to governing body, the need for a governing body, like step up and say, look, if we can turn this into something that has a return, then we are going to share it with the teams. Maybe I even, in an Escape Collective piece I wrote a while ago, I even came up with a mechanism to incentivize top privateers as well. I would like that privateers can remain in the sport, because I think it's cool, it's where it comes from. But also for this, you need mechanisms, you need to create a balance. And that is what I mean with governing body. And then, for instance, if we talk about this from the media side, then I think what is great about gravel and how it created this big fan base is that it grew very organically. A lot of the attention comes from media, athlete-made media like yourself, your podcast, a few people who grew it on YouTube, like Dylan and others. And that is not a problem that needs to be done away, and we need to sell broadcast rights. But I think we need to aggregate this and probably even say, look, on this end, we need to be a service provider to all you privateers. You create the content, which you do anyways, but we will help you with the marketing, with the promotion, selling ads against it, and so on, and making access easier. Because from a fan standpoint, the way I describe gravel often is, or I liken it to being an NBA fan in the 70s, which I haven't been, but people like Bill Simmons talk about it, and they describe how most games were not shown live, even the finals on tape delay, and many top players were mythical figures you just knew from newspaper snippets. And that is like talking about gravel racing on a podcast when many of the racers you cannot even see because it's never shown, is very different from experiencing most other popular sports, and that luckily is changing. But in the same vein, it is as big as it is right now because you are so relatable, and you, meaning all the privateers out there who make media and create this content. And I think it's a unique strength because it's how people like to follow sports in 2025. But how can I be a governing body, a service provider on this end as a series?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's definitely an interesting topic. You know, one of the areas that I think having some sort of greater structure is most pressing is just safety.
Yeah.
That to me is the biggest priority, frankly. In regards to how it develops more from a content standpoint, a coverage standpoint, I'm sure that will come. I don't think it's going to come in the next year or two, per se. There was a very close brush with a very large non-endemic partner for one of the series last year that unfortunately didn't pan out at the 11th hour, but that would have been one of those turning points. And that's sort of, you know, that can's been kicked down the road a little bit. But I think it would take something like that. To me, it's going to take, for real, a greater level of cohesion and sort of like the structure you're talking about. You know, you're using the term kind of governing body. I personally don't think it's going to be the UCI per se, because right now they don't really offer anything of value. For like the events are sort of like, they can just get away with stuff enough that they don't need some of the structure that the UCI would bring. So I don't know what that would look like. I think my bet is that rather than it being, okay, now the Gravelera Series is all UCI, or now all of the Grand Prix is UCI, I think it more likely that a big non-endemic presenting partner will come in. The money will 3x, 4x, 5x, and then just the entire professionalism kind of levels up. And there's just quick response to all that. But I don't know, when exactly that
me
would
be
happen.
frank. Let me be frank and say what probably you even couldn't say, but I will say it. I would hope that it is not the UCI. And as you say, I don't believe it is going to be the UCI just because they don't care enough right now. Like people are probably not aware, but the UCI is doing very little actually hands-on because all the series itself, the umbrella is managed by an agency that has like the mandate by the UCI, and then all the races are independent and coordinated to an extent by this agency. So yeah,
It's like Golazzo or who?
I think, yes, that rings a bell, but it's, I
Yeah.
think, a Belgium or Netherlands-based agency
Okay,
that does all this. So, yeah, the UCI doesn't care. And that is like back to the first thesis or point that I made. It's great that we have this competition. And I also hope and believe that some of the more commercially minded organizations out there can pull it off and create like what in other sports you would call a breakaway league, but just gravel is not road racing, and that is the big opportunity. Probably you followed the storyline of One Cycling that was killed recently by the UCI, but there was an attempt to do not a full-on breakaway league like Live Golf, but to do something probably where the ASO is not a big fan, but then the UCI should have been, and this didn't work out, probably for the better. But gravel is very different from this situation because right now you have already these entities. The UCI doesn't care if you race in the Gravel Earth Series like on the road. That would not work, right? Because they then would ban you from all UCI races. And that gives us freedom and flexibility. I believe that we are in this kind of critical time because you mentioned the story of cyclocross in the US. And at some point, if a new trend, a new sport that is popular emerges, it can go away again, like aggressive inline skating, which I used to do as a teenager, went away more or less completely, and skateboarding stayed. And in skateboarding, you had more structure emerging from within. It happened very organically, but it was able to stay because there were brands and media, and that is happening in gravel, luckily. But still, you can't rely on the bike industry to fully fund it. To your point of non-endemic sponsors, for people who are not familiar, that means sponsors, brands coming into the sport who don't have a background in cycling or are akin to cycling, like the Never Seconds and Mortons of this world and so on, but just like say Coca-Cola or whatever coming into the sport. And that I could fully believe could lead to such a game-changing moment, because it would likely also probably, hopefully, imagine something. I had the conversations and I just imagined, look, what if Red Bull would invest big into Gravel Earth Series, like one scenario. That is something that I heard of, to be clear about this, but just like they know how to run sports, build sports up. And if they would do it, then they would also very likely demand to have some more structure in this league itself. And I think that would be a good thing.
Yeah. No, without a doubt. Without a doubt. One thing I will say to that is I think I'm not concerned with this huge boom and then bust like we had in US cyclocross, because with a handful of races here in the States, at least, still a very large percentage of the participation field doesn't care what happens in the Grand Prix race, doesn't care if Keegan breaks his record, doesn't care if Kate Courtney sets a new record. They want to do Leadville because they just want to do Leadville before they die. End of story. And with the US Grand Prix of cyclocross, there wasn't that. There wasn't this huge grassroots population of bike enthusiasts who said, before I die, I have to go do that 7-minute lap at this random park in Connecticut. Like that aspirational bucket list component didn't exist with the USGP of cyclocross. It does exist with Unbound. It does exist with Leadville. to an extent it's developing, maybe with the Rift and some of the others. And so say this professionalism ramp happens and then it completely cannibalizes itself and it goes back down. I think it'll go back down to what we had in, say, like 2019 or 2018. It's not going to go back down to barely existing. I think the real question is just how high does this build happen, and what does it look like, and then is it sustainable?
Yeah, I fully agree, and that is like I look at the mass participation side to at least to an extent separate from the spectator sport side, but actually
sure.
but it's a cool segue to like another prediction, which is gravel live streams. And now we are in your wheelhouse, as you became also very famous as like the first color commentator on the first ever Unbound live stream. Self-created Unbound live stream by Lifetime or whatever. There was a broadcast before. But so they are still in search for the gravel native style. I wrote it down here, and the gravel native presentation, because much to your point from earlier, we cannot just copy road race broadcasting and apply this to gravel for various reasons, of course, the technical side, but also just because I think as a format, for instance, it completely ignores the mass participation side that is happening at all these races. And while there is some talk about should we have the pro race on a different day, I even think like, how can it be that is not even alluded to in most gravel live streams? How can we have a broadcast product where, yes, we see the high performance of the top athletes out there, but also show these like personal adventure stories of the people out there and incorporate it in some way, maybe with like pre-recorded footage. And I mean, they just take so many hours longer. You probably don't want a 15-hour Unbound live stream or whatnot, but these stories deserve being told, and they are frankly one of the reasons why so many people are in the sport and care about it. And this, I believe, is going to develop, and I hope to see more experimentation on this end. Probably.
Yeah, for sure. No, it's a great thought. So we sort of have, and this kind of goes back to what I'm always beating a dead horse about, which is just looking to other sports for some inspiration here. And we actually kind of have a version of this with Ironman Kona. So here in the States, we have what's called NBC Sports. They do our Tour de France coverage and that sort of thing. And I'm actually not sure if they still do it, but they used to do like a Thanksgiving Day Ironman Kona special, and it was like a 1.5 2-hour broadcast, and it's what you were talking about. It was a mix of the action from the front of the race and how it unfolded in combination with the person that did Ironman Kona, with some sort of disability, and it was their massive challenge, and they worked towards this goal for years and they completed it, that sort of story. And I mean, it was on our largest sports network in the country for years and years. For all I know, it still is. I haven't watched it for a couple of years, but and you could be walking through the airport and you watch it. And so I think that's a possible route for sure. I'm still not 100%. I'm a super fan. And so I was engaged throughout the entire Unbound broadcast, even when there were huge gaps. I stayed engaged. I think if we're being realistic, that won't appeal to a very broad audience. I just don't think that sort of race action will one day have millions of viewers. So I think the answer is more likely kind of what you're describing.
But does any cycling have millions of viewers, including the Tour de France? I mean, they have big numbers in their marketing. I mean, this year ratings dropped in some countries like
Pogie's fault.
30%. Yeah, maybe, but I mean, cycling is niche, and yes, I think, like, if we look at these early attempts, I would call them, of live streaming gravel races, there is certainly some stuff they could learn from the road, which I also understand the technical limitations, but like having more time gaps, more frequent time gaps, if you cannot have them live, maybe at some point live and so on, that would be nice, improve the viewer experience, just to be able to follow what is actually happening in the move. But then having more cameras working with some tools would also be nice. Like the one scene, of course, like I followed what Paul was doing at Unbound a bit, and at some way with like Mats Schmidt, he was bridging from the main group to the first chase group, and we never saw any pictures. I was checking Athlinks in real time, and they never appeared on the live stream. That was a bit that was a bit sad, but that is also the reality of like just early attempts and limited budgets and so on and so forth. So I think it could be a TV product. And I once even made the claim, like, road racing nowadays doesn't fit our time as well as gravel does, in the sense that, like, when this became a big sport, what did people care about? Like, riding a car was aspirational, like traveling. Like we talk like early 20th century up until the 60s when this appeared. That was different. Nowadays we hate being on the road, right? Who wants to be honked? People don't like driving because you're in traffic jams, at least here in Europe, maybe in the US, because it's so big, you have more different roads. But that is not what people crave. And people love the outdoors. They want to be outside. So I think a well-executed TV product would not be less appealing than most road races.
Okay. No, this is a great point. And actually, so this is going to be a big hot take, but there's going to be like you're saying, I'm glad you brought up the road racing analogy, because anytime a sport is not a stadium sport, NBA, football, whatever, cricket, rugby, there's going to be a lower ceiling. They're just not spectator friendly sports. I think the Tour, of course, it has the biggest viewership of any bike racing, but a huge piece of that just has to be because it's over 100 freaking years old. There's an enormous legacy there. It's a massive cultural spectacle. It's hugely international. And so just because of the sheer volume of those components, there's a certain like critical mass of viewership. But I think what you're saying is spot on. And there's a very real scenario here where good live TV coverage is a big step that helps our sport, but it remains simply a piece of the pie chart. And it's just an additional thing for the sorts of people who like consuming the sport in that way. But there will remain a certain number of fans who are quicker to reach for a recap episode with their favorite athlete, or an Instagram reel, or one of EF's incredible films with Lachlan. Like Vaughters loves to talk about how Lachlan creates far more impressions for them than their entire World Tour team, like he talks about that all the time. So I think that what your point is great. TV coverage is an important step, could be massively positive. Is it the silver bullet that launches us to the next stratosphere? I don't think so.
And just to be clear, I don't even talk about, so TV coverage is far away, I believe. Like live streams on YouTube, that is, I believe, the type of coverage that I mean, we're getting it for selected races, and I think more and more races will jump onto this. There was this, what is it called? I didn't know it until Holy Spirit posted about it, the Foco Fondo, which was live streamed. I never heard about the race before. Then it was live streamed, and I ended up watching it, and a few thousand other people did as well. I mean,
I didn't know it was being. I didn't know, this sounds bad, I didn't know what weekend the Foco Fondo was happening, let alone that it was being live streamed until after the race was over. So
yeah.
And I live in the same state.
I think their marketing department. So it ended up the stream, I think, brought a lot of awareness to the race. And maybe if you want to set yourself apart as a promoter of an indie race, then probably go the live stream route if you can afford it. I have no clue what the production prices is. I think it's below 6 figures, I would assume, if you want to do a simple version of it, but probably if you want to do it really well, it can go well above this as well. But
I mean, Gravel Worlds, I feel like Gravel Worlds Nebraska sort of just did what you talked about. They had that awesome live coverage last year, and everyone was like, oh, whoa, this race is making some moves. And now this year it's going to be...
But they were established. Unlike the Foco Fondo. Foco Fondo was like...
True. But my point is, Gravel Worlds Nebraska was well known, but didn't necessarily have the most competitive fields. And now this year, in combination with a great prize person being part of the Earth Series, I feel like that live stream last year really legitimized them in the eyes of a global racing field. And now it's going to be one of the deepest fields, of the year. Yeah.
I mean, the prize purse certainly plays its role. I think it's 100K split equally amongst men and women, if I have this correct top of mind. But so... but back to your last point, and I already mentioned this in the context of a different prediction, but let's double down on it. Like, the gravel media product needs to be multi-layered. We need live streams, we need athlete-made content, we need YouTube content, and we have it. It's all there, but what we don't have is like somebody taking it and turning it into a bundle and make it accessible. The more technical term you could use is aggregation. How can we create a simple way for fans to find all this content, and a simple way for brands to promote their products in this context without having to make like 20 deals with 20 privateers and so on? Because that is one big issue. It would be such a quick win if I would create this and offer all the 20 content makers among the 25 men, and the same on the women's side of Lifetime, and say, look, give me partial rights to your content. You still own it, but you give me partial rights, and I sell a sponsorship against this, and so on. Who would say no?
Thomas, I have a question. Why do we not have a news site, a cycling news, an Escape Collective, whatever, who only covers gravel? Why does that not exist yet? That's like that. And I know it's expensive. I know that there's startup costs and all that sort of thing. But in my mind, that is one of the single largest gaps. And it's just there for the taking. If I had a few 100K laying around and 30 hours in the day instead of 24, I would go do that right now, because it's just a gaping hole. It's exactly what you're talking about. I mean, you could talk to, I don't know, Dylan Johnson and be like, hey, Dylan, every third video you make, we're going to give you a percentage, and it gets embedded on our site, and you have a tab. I don't know, whoever, Paul, who I'm trying to think of someone who enjoys writing long form. Sarah Sturm. You're going to have a monthly column. And just like cycling news, there's headlines there. Here was the top 10 of the Rift. Here's what the points look like. Because like we've just been talking about, to figure out who's leading Gravel Earth right now, you have to scroll through a bunch of Instagram posts.
Yeah.
Like, it is just there for the taking, and it blows my mind that it hasn't been done yet.
So there are attempts. I mean, there is, I think, Pro Gravel Mac, it's called. They are trying to build something to that extent. Then we have the friends, quote unquote, regular listeners will know of Polvu, who had a website, then reverted to just being Instagram, and now whatever. But yeah, there is nobody doing it properly. I'm trying to lobby at a certain editor-in-chief, at a certain publication, to get on the phone to talk a bit about collaboration. I don't know if we need gravel only, but we need it to be taken seriously. And so of course, the big races are covered on the big cycling media. Probably that is also part of the answer, but I think there is no coverage of many of the other races, and in particular in Europe. That is, I think, because like even like something like Mid-South, I guess Velo and Cycling News and so on report about these results, but like nobody writes about UCI races and the smaller Gravel Earth Series races.
Yeah. So quick side story. When I was a junior, I must have been 14, 15 years old. Not even really, I was just getting into racing. Here in the States, we had at the time a pretty solid cross-country mountain bike series called the Pro XCT. And over the course of like 2009, 2010 through like 2014, it was really, really healthy. We had US factory teams. There wasn't as much money in it as we have in gravel now, but it was this short period where it felt like a consolidated series where young riders could develop themselves and then maybe move to the World Cup. One of the single biggest reasons that happened is because there was this guy named Colt McElveen, who's not really in the industry anymore, who walked around with a camcorder, and he did 90-second to 2.5 minute interviews with literally like first place through 45th place of every race, and uploaded them to YouTube the same day. He didn't really worry about quality. He was known by everyone, so he had this rapport with all of the racers. They were open with him. And I got to tell you, as a 14-year-old, I was just inhaling these interviews. It created heroes for me. He did little highlight videos. He'd stand out on the course and put together these 8 to 10 minute highlight videos, capture the sprint finishes. That is why I went towards mountain biking. That is why I ended up in mountain biking.
Maybe the answer is that we don't have the website because this is all emerging grassroots and we are too old. We think about why isn't there a website? But what we really what we have and what the 14 years old out there want is the Instagram content and the YouTube content, and that is.
But it can be YouTube. It can be YouTube. Yeah. Like my point is, I think someone could go out with their iPhone. And frankly, I don't know why Lifetime hasn't done this yet. Just hire someone who does 90-second. Gravel Earth right now does this better than Lifetime. They get interviews with the riders and upload it to Instagram. But do it at a greater volume, do it consistently, maybe even have some standardized questions, get it out the same day. And instead of having it on Instagram where you're beholden to the algorithm, and if you're lucky, you happen to see the content, put it in a consolidated place where fans can go and know that they're going to be able to watch it.
Yeah. And that is what I fully agree on, especially because you need to follow so many creators. I mean, of course, what we have, all of this exists, but as you say, it's no bundled nowhere, and I think that would be a quick win. And maybe we'll see it. I would hope that we will see it. But definitely the key, and I think from what you said, you agree on it, like all this is very important to the fan experience, and the live race can't be the only thing. And that's just where I get confused, because I see a lot of effort putting into the live streams, which on the one hand side, I love it. I think we need them, because if you cannot see the sport itself unfold, then you don't really have like a sport at all for fans out there.
For sure.
So that is needed. But then all that around, and the case in point, like I'm also a big NBA fan, and if you follow NBA podcasts and media, then you're also in this club. So hang on one second. You will hear that they very often get the most clicks during like draft season, and then in the what is it called, trade period, when the trades can be made.
Yep, that is deadline.
Trade deadline, exactly. Thanks. So that is this. There are, in cycling content in general, I almost want to do this series where I explore which NBA podcasts people who went into doing cycling content listen to religiously, because there are so many guys. Like I to keep file, I know Holy Spirit NBA fan, Chris Miller cycling NBA fan. Then this guy with the steep hills, I'm blanking on the name. Probably you know him. He rode up steep hills across the globe. That was his thing that made him YouTube famous. Also NBA fan, and I could rattle off more and more names. So there is something to it. I think people with the NBA background like making content around sport.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost like a
secret society.
It is. As someone that's in this professional cycling ecosystem, you might be able to listen or relate to this too. Sometimes when I listen to Bill talk about the business of the NBA, it's almost like a little bit of a hate listen, because the gulf between their professionalism and the professionalism of even the World Tour, it's just like, oh dear God, what are we doing? Like, it's not even funny. Can you imagine if an ASO equivalent, resided within the NBA? Like, it would, like, what would that look like? But I mean, it's
that should be the next goal for, by the way, talking about media and gravel. I think somebody should advocate for writing about at least lifetime Grand Prix races on the Ringer.
Oh, I have a feeling Bill wouldn't sign off on that, but it would be cool.
I mean, they sometimes have, like, they cover certain niche sports, especially if it is happening in the US from time to time.
Yeah.
So who knows?
Almost like as a like just an exotic. Haha! Did you know this existed? Yeah, totally. Yeah. I feel you.
Cool. So
I did. You know what's interesting is I shot a little piece with ESPN last month. They were doing this 50 states in 50 days thing, it's called. And one of their news anchors, I synced up with one of their news anchors, and we shot a little piece showing him how to go mountain biking. He went on his first mountain bike ride, and it was pretty cool. It played on repeat on ESPN on a Saturday all day. The most cycling coverage that ESPN has done in ages. But what was cool is they knew who Poggi was, and the news anchor specifically said he's really been pitching ESPN on doing more cycling coverage, because their hook is, right now cycling is having their Michael Jordan moment, and they should be telling that story. It would be a shame to miss that story. And so there is conversation there, even in the United States, about covering some cycling. But it's just it's just like such a different thing than the other ecosystems within professional sports that I think it's a tough sell.
Yeah, maybe. But they didn't bring Reggie Miller to your mountain bike thing there as well?
He's not technically an ESP. He's not an ESPN employee until January 1st, I think.
Okay. But he's
TNT,
a mountain biker, no?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, but then if he's still under TNT contract, then can't be the face.
They'll move over soon, I think.
So did we miss something in terms of the future of gravel that we still need to talk about, that is top of your mind?
Good question. No, not really. That was really thorough. I don't think so. I mean, we could keep rambling about variations of what we've already covered, but that seemed pretty thorough to me.
Maybe the one aspect that I ignored, I don't know why, but you mentioned safety. Do you think races are going to change in the next few years to increase safety? Will the SBT story repeat or not? Or are there other innovations in safety that you came across?
I think one of the tricky things is that one of the reasons it's so profitable to hold gravel races is because it's still kind of the Wild West when it comes to checks and balances for safety,
Yeah.
especially here in the United States. I mean, look, one of the main reasons that the Amgen Tour of California went away is because it's so expensive to close roads and hire police officers to control traffic. In Europe, it's so much easier to go to a local municipality and be like, hey, we want to run a bike race. And they're like, oh, cool. Yeah, we've done 37 of those in the last 25 years. Here's who you talk to. We just don't really have that in the States. I have heard some belly aching about how increasingly dangerous the Traca is getting. So I don't think it's only a US problem. But, you know, many of the biggest gravel races are still in the United States, and we probably have more challenges when it comes to securing safety. I do think there are things that can be done that aren't a huge lift financially. But then the other kind of tricky part you run into is just tradition. You know, the Leadville 100 has been around since the early 90s, and that out and back format is part of what makes it special and famous. Yeah. It is the single most dangerous thing we have to do every year. It's awful. And so it's just sort of like this impasse. And I don't know. I think more conversations are happening. Ironically, the fact that some of these races are being live streamed, I think, is maybe now bringing more awareness to the race promoters about what we have to put up with every race. Mm-hmm. I'm sure everyone has seen that meme of a bus driving into the peloton 15 seconds into Leadville. That's just laughable. I mean, it makes me feel like some of the races I've done, you know, in Argentina, for example, where you're just like doing an alley cat between buses, just hoping you don't die. Like sometimes it just like, it's like, really, this is what's happening. So without a doubt, some things need to happen. I think the first, to me, priority is feed zones. Something has to happen at the unbound feed zones. Something has to happen at the Leadville feed zones. I don't know what that is, but until a very, very serious accident happens, it seems like many organizers are willing to kick the can down the road a little bit. But in my mind, it is a matter of time until a very well-known racer has a career-ending injury, and then they won't be able to ignore it anymore. I just hope that something happens before that eventuality.
Yeah, let's hope so. I mean,
I like coming home. I like coming home and petting my dog. I don't have a kid. I was thinking about my sweet dog as I was descending Columbine a few days ago. I'll just say that. Maybe not the best headspace to be in when you're trying to chase down a gap.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean that is ludicrous. I mean, I had never seen it live, and just from hearing this, you can check. I asked AI to create a nice cover photo for the Leadville Preview newsletter post, and you will see how it. I wanted it to be about this topic of riders going in all directions at the same time, and then seeing it in live, it's a thing. There was this.
It used to be fine.
When Melissa goes up, I don't know it's after. I don't know if it is a power line or where, but she goes up this passage, and then five guys come down, and one just misses her. So yeah, like.
I mean, it used to be fine because there were 5 people who were going 70K an hour down the descent, and there were 5 minutes between them. Now there's 50 people going 70K an hour, and they're all separated by 5 seconds. So it's just been another representation of the evolution of the sport, and we just need some safety adjustments to keep up with the pace of the competition.
Let's just bring in the UCI after all, and they can do the same as they did in road. Guys, you need to be slower. Let's ride slower.
That's the thing, you know, like if sometimes I do get pretty fired up with my friends who are in positions of organization at these events. And understandably, sometimes their response is, tell me a bike race that is safe. You know,
Yeah.
like the UCI isn't exactly crushing it necessarily either.
No. I mean, there were road races early this season. I remember where we also had cars coming, like some of these French races whose name nobody
Oh,
knows
yeah.
unless Patrick Bro. But they also had like I think they even canceled stages or riders didn't continue riding because I mean, it happens there as well, but it's not good and shouldn't be acceptable. And then like one story we talked about here, I think like at least among European gravel pros, it was quite well known, like the Sofia Skofgard Hansen crash at Unbound, where she then had to lie for, I believe, like 90
hour and
minutes.
a half. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I will say,
arrived.
to their credit, this year, Lifetime put actual GPS trackers on our bikes, mandatory. And a big piece of it was safety. So if your GPS tracker stopped moving, they knew exactly where you were and people were on their way. And that was a direct response to what happened with Sophie at Unbound. So there are changes being made. Should there be 500 people leaning into a feed zone where racers are racing in both directions? Maybe not.
Yeah. and maybe the official TV crews shouldn't step in the second placed riders' way as well. So yeah, but
that would be awesome. That would be great.
Hey, so on that note, I think I took up a lot of your time, but I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks a lot for this, and hope to continue this once we see a bit of the future materialize.
Absolutely, thank you, Thomas. I appreciate you doing what you're doing, and I think it's really important that there are creators and people covering the sport who are very invested, who are not the racers, because you often have more perspective than us, because you can see the forest for the trees a little bit, as we would say in the States. We're awfully close to it, and sometimes for that reason lack a little bit of perspective, maybe.
A different perspective for that.
Different perspective. Yeah, for sure.
Hey, take care.
Likewise. Thank you.